propaganda. There will be either complete and total Aryan victory in a 1,000-year Reich, or there will be the victory of the Jews and the complete destruction of the Aryan man. One Nazi theorist and proponent of propaganda, Walter Schulz-Wetzungen, wrote, "Many one laughed at the propaganda of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in the past from a position of superiority. It is true that we had only one thing to say, and we yelled and screamed and propagandized it again and again with a stubbornness that drove the wise to desperation. We proclaimed it with such simplicity that they thought it absurd and almost childish. They didn't understand that repetition is the precursor to success, and simplicity is the key to the emotional and mental world of the masses. We wanted to appeal to the intuitive world of the great masses, not the understanding of the intellectuals." So the idea was to speak the common man's language, not to get into arguments at the intellectual class that would be understood by few. The purpose was to speak to the working class, a bottom-up movement. And the fascists utilized mass media and marketing, and speaking the language of consumerism and even advertising, recognizing the role that the mass media played in the lives of the masses. Now, it's not as if everyone was swayed by their message, that everyone in Nazi Germany supported the Nazi Party with all their heart and souls. There were those who were convinced of the message, those who had their reservations, and those who doubted the message. And the Nazi Party never even broke 40% of the vote, even though they were Europe's most electorally successful European fascist party. But it was still successful enough to mobilize the nation to war that they very well prosecuted in its first few years. And this is why Hitler and his propaganda ministers had a need for a serial creation of enemies. And different enemies that were perceived by Nazi Germany of communists and gypsies and other people, bankers, were all rolled up into one super enemy, the Jews. This is a way that he could weaponize tribal passion and arouse emotions and render people vulnerable to his type of persuasion. Okay, so that was the theory of Nazi propaganda. How did it actually play out in the policies of the Ministry of Propaganda in terms of things like books and film and the banning of books and the banning of film? The Nazis established a rigid system of book censorship and had indices of undesirable books that lasted from the 1930s until the end of the war. Günter Louis lists all this in his book, Harmful and Undesirable, Book Censorship in Nazi Germany, and he notes that about 5,500 book titles were banned by the end of the war. The list was mainly made up by the Reich Chamber of Literature, and banned books include those of alleged moral corruption, works that support communism or Marxism or pacifism, and what is deemed to damage the martial spirit and morale of the German people and those propagating the Catholic faith or other non-Protestant confessional ideas, or really anything that failed to live up to what was to be expected in the new Germany. But especially books that were banned were equated with being Jewish, which was quintessentially un-German according to Nazi ideology. After the Nuremberg laws were implemented in 1935, but there were questions of what it meant to ban something that was Jewish. After the Nuremberg laws were implemented in 1935, there were questions of, do you ban books or publishing houses that were owned by three-quarter Jews, half Jews, quarter Jews? And also, many of the publishing houses were Jewish-owned, so it meant a loss of publishing income in the 1930s with government taxation. But Joseph Goebbels said that culture triumphed economic need. And he noted that, quote, 40% of all German authors had been Jews who had developed their decadent and corrosive version of German literature in order to subjugate the German people, a step in the Jewish conspiracy to rule the world. So many Jewish authors were, of course, on the list of banned authors, like Franz Kafka, Franz Werfel, and others. The most notorious attempts to cleanse German literature had to do with Nazi book burnings. There were ceremonial book burnings in Nazi Germany and Austria in the 1930s. The books that were targeted for being subversive were similar to those that appeared on the list of banned books. They were written by Jewish, pacifist, liberal, anarchist, socialists, authors, and those who had nonconformist views of gender and sexuality. In 1933, the Office for Press and Propaganda of the German Student Union called for a nationwide action against the un-German spirit, the climax in what they called a literary cleansing by fire. Historian Karl Dietrich Brocker wrote, The exclusion of left, democratic, and Jewish literature took precedence over everything else. Local chapters were to supply the press with releases and commission articles, sponsor well-known Nazi figures to speak at public gatherings, and negotiate for radio press time. At this and other meetings, students threw banned books into bonfires and ceremonies that include singing, oaths, live music, and incantations. In one festival in Berlin, 40,000 people heard Joseph Goebbels deliver an address, "No to Decadence and Moral Corruption," is what it was called. He said that the era of extreme Jewish intellectualism is now at an end. The breakthrough of the German Revolution has again cleared the way of the German path. The future German man will not just be a man of books, but a man of character. It is to this end that we want to educate you. As a young person, to already have the courage to face the pitiless glare, to overcome the fear of death, and to regain respect for death, this is the task of this young generation. And thus you do well in this midnight hour to commit to the flames the evil spirit of the past. This is a strong, great, and symbolic deed. A deed which should document the following for the world to know. Here, the intellectual foundation of the November Republic is sinking to the ground, but from this wreckage, the phoenix of a new spirit will triumphantly rise. Well, the book burning was an international controversy, and those whose books were burned responded back. Helen Keller published an open letter to German students, and she said, "You may burn my books and the books of the best minds of Europe, but the ideas these books contain have passed through millions of channels and will go on." And what happened to these authors, in addition to their books being burned, some of them went into exile, like Albert Einstein or Sigmund Freud. Others lost their citizenship, like Kurt Tucholsky, or they had to go into self-imposed exile. Some were sent to concentration camps due to the conditions of their imprisonment, or they were even executed. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. When these books were removed, they were replaced by books that promoted Nazi ideology, especially in schools. New textbooks were written that taught students obedience to the party, love for Adolf Hitler, and most of all, anti-Semitism. This was coupled with after-school meetings of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls to train faithfulness to the Nazi Party among the youth. And celebrations like Adolf Hitler's birthday and the anniversary of his taking power essentially became holidays. Now, even though there was banning of books, authors had clever ways of trying to get around censors. If you wanted to be critical of the Nazi regime, you had to be clever, especially after the rise of Hitler in 1933. There arose Tarnschriften, or camouflage publications, which were a way to avoid German censorship in Germany between 1930 and 1945. There was an estimated 9,000 to 10,000 such publications that were produced in this time, which were issued with up to 40,000 copies per title, and about 80% of these were made by the Communist Party of Germany. One such book was titled A Treatise on the Latest Traffic Regulations for Cyclists. Another one was a guide on how to shield potatoes from frost. They were designed to be as boring as possible and as overlookable as possible. But one of these titles, on the inside, contained socialist and anti-fascist thought that talked about organizing a resistance against the Nazi regime. And other bits of content included some questions on the fight against Hitler's war policies and reflections on Spain and the duty of the German anti-fascists. And it also provided information on how to support political prisoners and their families, and to one extent it's beneficial to volunteer in official positions like a helper in an air raid shelter. Another book was disguised as an anti-Semitic work called The Foundations of the Jewish People, A Necessary Reckoning. But within the book, it contains an account of the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany. And the camouflage part of these books were small compared to the bulk of the regular text. The anti-Semitic book has 188 pages, but the camouflage portion is only 22 pages. And the camouflage part is also smaller than the regular book, so it can easily be hidden in the pages of another book or slipped into a pocket. Now, let's get into film, because this is the other component of Nazi propaganda. Even before the rise of the Nazi Party in 1933, there were attempts to subvert the German film industry, which in the 1920s and 1930s was arguably the most advanced in the world. And in fact, many political refugees out of Nazi Germany went to Hollywood and helped build up that film industry and offer their technical expertise. On December 5th, 1930, Joseph Goebbels disrupted the premiere of a film. He and his stormtroopers disrupted the premiere of All Quiet on the Western Front, a film based on a novel of the same name. There, Nazi protesters threw smoke bombs and sneezing powder to stop the film. The novel itself had been unpopular with the Nazis, who thought that its depiction of the pointlessness and absurdity of war was against the German spirit. The film was eventually banned, and the director of the film emigrated to Switzerland in 1931, and his citizenship was revoked in 1938. The Nazi film policy was to show films in large cinemas with large audiences to affect the feeling of a crowd, going back to Joseph Goebbels' idea that the mass consciousness needed to be affected and steered, not just individual intellect and logic. What it could do was overwhelm the individual spectator, so that critical film perception would crumble. Film shows also took place in factories and military barracks, and the Hitler Youth arranged special film programs with newsreel and propaganda films shown. The party propaganda department operated 300 film trucks to show films in rural and remote areas, and they carried all the necessary equipment for showing films in village inns, which was pretty technically advanced, bringing this equipment to small, rural, remote villages in the 1930s. Television signals existed in Nazi Germany, and Nazis wanted to use television as a medium for their propaganda, but there weren't enough television sets to be able to reach a large enough audience. And cinemas continued to operate throughout the war and up till the end of the war. Even after schools and playhouses stopped working in 1944, cinemas continued to operate, and in Berlin, anti-aircraft units were specifically posted to protect local cinemas. Joseph Goebbels wanted cinema to promote escapism, to distract the population and keep people in good spirits, because he believed that Germany was defeated in World War I because the morale of the people wasn't sustained. So this explains early propaganda films like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will that records the Nuremberg rallies and shows thousands and thousands of soldiers in perfect line formation and an enormous crowd surrounding them. You also have anti-Semitic films like The Eternal Jew. Beyond promoting fictional films, there were also newsreels. The German Weekly Review was a series of weekly newsreels that were released in the cinemas of Nazi Germany from 1940 until the end of the war, and there were something like 755 released total. Newsreels would precede the main feature film, and these type of newsreels were also in Western Europe and the rest of the United States as well. After the Battle of Stalingrad, in which the German military was defeated and starts to recede, Goebbels thought that it was critical that the spirit of Germany be kept sustained, so he ordered an increase of efforts to manipulate the war reporting to keep up the perseverance of the German people. But he couldn't overwhelm eyewitness reports of soldiers via military mail, and of course what Germans were seeing with their own eyes with Allied strategic bombing on German cities. Well, to go back to our analogy that propaganda and war went hand in hand in the mind of the Nazi Party, propaganda campaigns were launched before military campaigns in 1939. Before Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Nazi regime launched an aggressive media campaign to build public support for the war. They played up what they called Polish atrocities, referring to physical violence and discrimination, whether real or imagined, against ethnic Germans living in Poland. The press and film depicted the Polish as warmongers and chauvinistic, and the Nazi regime also attacked the British for encouraging war by promising to defend Poland in the event of a German invasion. Nazis even staged a border incident to make it appear that Poland initiated the aggressive hostilities. On August 31st, in 1939, SS men dressed in Polish army uniforms staged an attack on a German radio station. The next day, Hitler announced that he would send troops to Poland in response to these incursions. The Nazi press office instructed the press to avoid the use of the word war. They were announcing that the German troops had simply beaten back the Polish attacks to make the Germans feel as if they were the victims of an aggression. And this would leave the responsibility for declaring war to the British and the French. The playing up of Polish atrocities fed into the Nazi marketing machine